Hi, everybody. I'm Kimberly Olafson, and this is CRJS 5180, and it's with Dr. Brooke Galapsos. This is CRJS. Oh, I told you that. Anyways, my presentation is victimization of men emerging from the war on drugs, from Superpredator to Survivor. And so it examines how men reentering society after drug related incarceration experience secondary victimization, not only through stigma, but through moral misclassification that erases their capacity for redemption. Men criminalized under the war on drugs. Um, it it categorizes them as structural victims, um, not moral monsters. And so I'm focusing on victimization that is policy made, narrative driven, and cumulative. So this is not about excusing harm. It's about accurate classification of the harm. And so this presentation, it also examines the digital commons in which men returning from incarceration now live, um, emphasizing the need to understand online spaces as part of the reentry environment. So men are examined as a distinct population due to the unique relational, structural, and identity-based challenges that they face during reentry, including stigma, isolation, barriers to belonging, which require gender responsive and context specific approaches. Um, so let me go ahead and um, so the historical backdrop, um, in the absence of legitimate institutional protections, individuals developed informal ethical systems that prioritized restraining, boundary setting, and collective survival rather than predation. And that's Anderson 99 and Haney 2006. And so, like Haney and Anderson suggest, when institutions abandoned these men, morality didn't dissolve, it adapted. And so, according to Haney, incarceration itself redefines moral frameworks as survival mechanisms. And uh, Anderson 1999, Code of the Streets, shows how informal ethics emerge where formal justice withdrawals. Um, so it's basically, I mean, if you think about it, they threw us to the wolves and then we built a pack. And we learned how to protect instead of prey. And so it's the myth that made the monster. And so super predator um, narrative, it equals the panic weaponized. And then addiction plus poverty, it reframed as predatory intent. And so media collapses survival behavior into criminal identity. Policy transforms marginalized men into symbols of fear. And the link here with victimology is that narrative harm precedes the physical harm. Um, and this labeling at the macro level is state sponsored deviance creation. You have to think about the Biswanger study, um, that was done on the uh, inmates leaving the institutions, and they've shown that the mortality rate within that first 2 weeks is 12 times higher. Um, um, and I would like to say what that is indicative of, but I can't because I don't have any numbers right now to make that claim. I didn't look. I probably should have. Um, but we have to consider. I'm talking about the children of the parents who were the initial victims of the war on drugs. These are those children who um, lost their parents in this struggle, and some of them remained in the foster care system. And so ACE is probably I don't have the numbers to quote, but it's probably one of the most common predictors of incarceration. And so ACEs is cumulative victimization. And you have to think about it. Their first ACE was the fact that their parents were incarcerated. And that just amplifies everything after that. And so early adversity does not equal criminal destiny. And that's Faletti et al., 98. Trauma increases vulnerability within punitive systems. War on drugs layers state violence on childhood trauma. It produces cumulative victimization across the life course. And the victimology shift. Harm is um, processal. It's not episodic. And systems respond to trauma with punishment. And that's the secondary wounding. Um, and I just want to say this, dental hygiene, lack of dental hygiene when you're incarcerated is another secondary trauma. Um, the stigma that all dental issues are drug related is what we face. And then of course I'm not clear how the United States has decided that chewing food is not healthcare. Um, having teeth to chew food adequately is something that everybody needs, but especially vulnerable human beings. Vulnerable human beings absolutely need health care. They need mental health care. They need dental care. Um, and they need good rest. And they need somatic health practices, but I'll get into that later. But dental care, for some reason in the United States, we've decided that it's cosmetic. It only has to do with the way you look. Um, and it also is important the way you look, and especially when it's the mouth, because everybody's focused in on your teeth, your mouth. And the individuals with the dental issues can see the reaction. People don't look at you. Um, and and so um, dental care is harm reduction. And I don't have any facts for that. That's just my opinion. Um, and then the double victimization. ACEs and cumulative victimization. Oh, whoops, I already did that. Here we go. So the double victimization, first, the victimization is the structural deprivation, and then the criminalization. And the second victimization is then the stigma, the exclusion, the moral condemnation. And post release punishment continues informally. And it mirrors secondary victimization literature in victimology. Harm is policy driven and narrative based. It's not incidental. The system never stops punishing, it just changes the uniforms. And once an individual has completed their sentence, they've completed their community custody, and they've paid their LFOs, why do they carry a lifetime sentence? That is the thing I think that is most concerning and confusing to me. Um, and it's pasted out there for the public that anybody can search this and weaponize it against you. And that's exactly what it is. It does. Any job that anybody goes to get, everybody pulls their criminal history. And I think there's some legitimacy to this, but I think we have a far overreach in how much of this um, is public after a human being has fulfilled their side of the bargain. It's no longer public information because that era is over once all those things are completed. And so let me go to the next slide. The victim examined in this project are the men emerging from the war on drugs. So their parents were incarcerated. There's their first aches, and then everything else is compounded on top of that. And so during the 1990s, the super predator narrative and the war on drugs merged to criminalize addiction and poverty as a moral evil. Media and policy blurred survival with predation, transforming people into propaganda. And the men, um, the men in the justice system, they get brought in via policy funnels, and it's not random actors. They're selected by the environment. So criminal records become identity cages, and victimhood is erased because harm is state inflicted. So victimology, the blind spot, is the criminalized victims. And so I seek to restore victim recognition um, where it's been denied. And here's the thing is that in order to move away from anything, you have to be able to name it first and have it be validated. If these men aren't validated that yeah you were harmed, um it makes it extraordinarily challenging to move away from something that everybody is gaslighting you about or denying that it is even harmful. So if it's not harmful, how can you even move from it? And so I think these are important things to think about when we talk about harm reduction. Um, and so a drug is a drug is a drug. Um, and you'd be surprised what you could say what a drug is when we're talking about rewarding that pleasure center, right? So addiction itself demonstrates how the brain's reward circuitry meant for survival becomes hijacked by trauma and deprivation. And that's Sapolsky in 2017. And so the war on drugs ignored this biology, moralizing chemistry instead of treating it. Recognizing addiction as a neuroadaptive survival response frames users as victims of structural neglect, not moral failure. And I just want to say that, I mean, I think it's been 40, 50 years that the rat park study was done. And clearly in that study, it was shown that the rats, if they had a conducive environment, conducive to help and growth, that they didn't choose the drugs. They chose water and healthy food. And so it's indicative that if the environment is healthy, the people in the environment will be healthier. It's just logic. Um, and it's not to say that it's a fix for everybody. Um, but it is our responsibility when it comes to harm to institute harm reduction, because this isn't about the people who aren't harmed by these things, because some people aren't. It's about the edge sitters. It's about the vulnerable. Um, and so, did I read that to you? I just want to make sure. Um, oh, yeah. So, addiction, it hijacks the survival circuitry, um, and then um, s- so pathologizing survival responses is what we do. Um, and policy has criminalized brains um, doing what brains do under stress. Um, and when we don't acknowledge that, they can't move from it into something different. Um, oh, drug is a drug, yes. Um, I didn't show you this. So addiction, compulsion, overconsumption operate through shared neurological pathways, regardless of the substance or the behavior. The brain's reward circuitry designed for survival. Um, yeah, let's see. Let's go to the next slide. Ethical systems behind bars and beyond. Um, and so hierarchies form around unwritten codes. And you can see, especially in the online digital spaces, there's definitely codes and hierarchies and structure, particularly around the harm against children. That is one thing that's not tolerated. And it's nationally. And then depending on how criminals, inmates, deal with other offenders who have committed crimes against women, um, those issues tend to be addressed more on a geographical um, uh, scale. It's the not all gangs are represented in all prisons, okay? And prison gangs aren't necessarily gangs out on the street, right? And so you might be affiliated with one, and then you go in and then you have to affiliate with something else because your affiliation is not there. Um, and so it's those affiliations that determine how we respond to other inmates coming into these spaces. Um, and it's definitely a hierarchy, and it's orderly. Um, and, and they mete out their own justice both behind bars in their groups and when they return home. And so the informal moral codes emerge where the legitimacy is absent. So we don't touch women, we don't touch children. These are peer regulated ethics, peer regulated. And Anderson and Goffman order, it's order without state legitimacy. And it shows moral agency persists under confinement, and it counters the dehumanization narrative. And the insight here is that harm does not erase morality, but it does reshape it. Um, and then my next slide here, prolonged confinement and stigmatization erode identity and agency. And so labeling leads to shame. Shame fuels resistance. Resistance opens space for reconstruction. And within confinement, identity erodes. But narrative, art, writing, music, storytelling, these become a means of rehumanization. And so the labeling, shame, and narrative repair. And so the narrative becomes survival technology. Art and stories restore moral selfhood. Victimology plus narrative theory converge, and identity repair equals repairing the harm. You have to repair their identity, their agency, their self esteem. Sending rehabilitation, so sending people out from prison unprepared for what they have to deal with. And Biz Wonger has shown how critical this first 2 weeks is when somebody's re entering society and bridging that critical gap. And those numbers tend to go down the longer somebody's been out of prison. But it is still extraordinarily high, much higher than the population at large, even several years after. And so it's a great concern. Um, so resistance opens space for identity reconstruction, and you can see this happening in real time with the reentry. I call it reentry genre, prison genre. These guys that have started up these YouTube channels, and some of it is great content, edifying, and um, even academic, you could say. But then there's other parts of it that are just extraordinarily harmful. And especially when you talk about pedophiles. And I think the only thing I really want to say about that is that this is part of the psychological narrative for um, inmates is they're saying, you're saying that we're bad, so you've put us in this box for our time out. But then you put pedophiles in here with us, and we're not that bad. We're drug addicts, but we're not that bad. And there's that distinct line that has always been there. And um, that one does not waver um, ge- ge- jo- from prison to prison or geographic location, right? The violence against women, that can be changed by those things. And so this is my favorite part. So somatic and trauma informed reentry. And so that line I said, they threw us to the wolves and we built a pack that learned to protect instead of prey. This line just captures the core argument within communities abandoned by formal justice ethics didn't just vanish, they evolved underground. And like Haney and Anderson suggest, when institutions abandoning these men's morality didn't just dissolve, it adapted. And according to Haney, incarceration itself redefines um, moral frameworks as survival mechanisms. While Anderson, 1999, Code of the Street, shows how informal ethics emerge where formal justice withdraws. Um, and so, when I think about that, I think about like s- some of these inmates were maybe not subculture yet, right? They were on subculture periphery. And then this myth of the super predator. And once they're criminalized, once they're brought into the system, now they've fully adopted that complete um, package of the subculture personification. Because at first, maybe they're just, the edge sitter of the personification, the edge sitter of the subculture. But once that line is crossed into the prison environment, that that um, that that prison culture is no longer peripheral. It is absolute within. Um, and mind you, that is my opinion. Um, and so um, the healing turn from trauma informed healing um, to healing centered. And so, where trauma informed care diagnoses wounds, healing centered engagement restores power. And and that's Gannett Wright. Ginwright, 2018. And recovery here is not rebellion, but transcendence. Men reclaiming fatherhood, community, and peace. And this is not, recovery is messy. It's not linear. It's all over the place. Um, and so trauma informed is just not sufficient. Healing centered engagement restores power plus meaning. People need to feel empowered. And whatever meaning they make um, to help with their empowerment, but we need to start those meaning making well before people are exiting these institutions. Um, um, and so, in anyways, men emerging from the war on drug, they're secondary and structural victims. Victimization includes structural and cultural harm. Um, and then, oh, justice becomes relational, not coercive. And because it is relational. Reentry and healing and recovery is relational. There may be some structure within that, but it demands relation. And um, our systems are structural, they are not relational. They're structural and transactional. Um, and this is a very important distinction. And so reclaiming humanity in justice reform. And so justice is not justice as presence, right? And not as punishment. Labels collapse under structural analysis. Men are shaped by violence plus narrative distortion. Rehumanization equals public safety. Rehumanization equals public safety. Fear dissolves when truth enters. This is victimology doing its actual job. And so this is grounded in victimology, sociology, neuroscience, and it integrates Alexander, Biswanger, Haney, Morona, Western, and it demonstrates the interdisciplinary coherence and theory that supports lived reality, not the other way around. And I did want to say, um, oh, I did say that about um, sitting on the edge of subculture. Um, and then once that in confinement, incarceration occurs, then you've crossed into full-fledged subculture. So thank you so much.